Thousands of Americans lose a part of their wage every single day. Employers pay less than the minimum wage or do not pay for overtime, and more often than not, get away with it. For some rich and powerful companies, some sort of wage theft is common practice. Other types of theft, like shoplifting, is petty cash compared to the amount that employers and companies are stealing from workers who are often poor to begin with. The pandemic has made these matters worse, especially for restaurant workers and immigrants.
Steal from the poor, give to the rich.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to We the People. I'm your host, Daniel Arya, and in this episode, we're going to discuss wage theft in America. Why is wage theft so underreported, and what are authorities doing to stop it? Who is the most affected by wage theft, and are some communities hit harder than others? As usual, we are pleased to have our two guests on our show, Yamir Chabur, who's a political analyst at the Bolivarian Flame, and Max Perry, an independent investigative journalist. Stay tuned.
According to the Wage Justice Center, Los Angeles is the wage theft capital of the United States. Low-wage workers in Los Angeles lose $1.4 billion to wage theft every year, and other big cities like Chicago and New York are trailing close behind. The three cities combined account for $3 billion in wage theft each year.
Every year, workers in the U.S. lose billions of dollars in wages that they are supposed to receive, and this is usually done to low-wage workers. The wealthy empty the pockets of the poor to fill their own bursting coffers. Almost a quarter of temporary workers say that they have had their wages stolen from them by their employers. Most of these workers are being paid low wages to begin with. So is getting a low wage these days in these corporations a widespread practice?
Yeah, I believe it's very widespread, just for the fact that a lot of Americans are starting to see a massive inflation that's going on through the country, that their wages are not equating with their way of life. And Americans are starting to see that certain companies that are very wealthy, like let's say an Amazon, a Walmart, or Starbucks, should be paying their workers more. And they've seen this with the pandemic, given the fact that a lot of these companies have become, have made a lot of money during the pandemic.
Now, there are at least 650,000 low-wage workers in Los Angeles alone that lose about $26.2 million a week. Average amount of wages stolen from each worker amounts to about $40 a week, which represents 12.5% of a worker's total income. Now, these people are already making under $20,000 a year and are shortened more than $2,000 annually, although there are many cases that are losing much larger amounts. Now let's see Max Perry's opinion on this story. Max.
Well, wage theft, which is the illegal withholding of wages by employers, wage theft in the United States is actually a very widespread problem. So pervasive, in fact, that there was a recent report by the Economic Policy Institute, which showed that the U.S. government retrieved more than $3 billion in unpaid wages in the last 3 years alone. I believe it was from 2017 to 2020, just in that period, and that's actually only a fraction of the full amount that's been stolen by employers from workers' paychecks.
Just in Los Angeles, the vast majority of wage theft violations are due to failure to pay minimum wage, and from the workers who do report wage theft or try to unionize, almost half experience some sort of retaliation, which ranges from getting fired to reduction of hours or verbal abuse. The UCLA Labor Center reviewed wage claim data from 2008 to 2011 and found that 83% of companies that were ruled against by the Labor Commissioner never paid back any wages. Are minimum wages even enough to live with?
Absolutely not. A lot of Americans are starting to see that there's a massive price increase in the country, and this is all due to neoliberalism and capitalism. So let's say like the state of New York, that they say the minimum wage is supposedly $15 an hour. People cannot live off of that with paying rent out here that's like over $200 to $3,000 a month.
Shoplifting crimes always attract front-page news, while more than $15 billion stolen by corporations from workers receives no coverage at all. This shows that in the United States, only a certain type of theft, which is done by individuals and more often poor individuals, is newsworthy. Thieves stealing merchandise valued under $1,000 would be paraded on news channels and end up in jail, while corporations steal billions of dollars from the poor and never end up behind bars.
Wow.
Now check out this video from June 2021 showing a man stealing from Walgreens in San Francisco went viral. According to San Francisco's crime database, value of the stolen merchandise was between $200 and $950. In most of the coverage, the video was represented as proof that shoplifting takes place without consequence, while the man in the video was arrested and held in jail without bail, facing 15 counts, including grand theft, second-degree burglary, and shoplifting.
Empty shelves at this Walgreens drugstore, and it's not because of pandemic-related panic shopping. Now the store is closing due to what local reports are calling a spree of rampant shoplifting. And look at this, just 15 minutes after an Inside Edition crew showed up at the drugstore, we found this guy jumping over the front counter, taking an airbed, and leaving the store on his scooter. No questions asked, no one stopping him.
It's interesting to point out that only a few months before this incident, Walgreens paid a $4.5 million settlement to resolve a class action lawsuit alleging that it stole wages from thousands of its employees in California between 2010 and 2017. The lawsuit states that Walgreens rounded down employees' hours on their time cards and failed to pay premium wages to employees who were denied legally required meal breaks. According to the order approving the settlement, the amount only represents 22% of the potential damages.
Unfortunately, the federal government is not a neutral player between employers and workers, and very often, not just the IRS, but the government itself is actually passing legislation that increases the likelihood workers will experience violation. For example, under the Trump administration, he issued an executive order to the Department of Labor that rolled back many of the protections, labor standards, and economic regulations that shielded workers from wage theft and undermined the Department of Labor. It's supposed to be enforcing the minimum wage.
While the Walgreens shoplifter was behind bars for shoplifting, no one at Walgreens was forced to take personal responsibility for stealing millions from its employees. It's ironic that the Walgreens CEO, who was working during the majority of the wage theft, had his compensation rise from about $7 million in 2015 to more than $17 million in 2020. So how do large corporations get away with wage theft?
The easy answer to that is basically because we live in a capitalist society, a neoliberalist society, so the state benefits the higher ups, the CEOs, the big bosses. So the laws are there to protect them. But to get into more detail, you could have like a company with low-wage workers that, they pay them minimum wage and they steal from them yearly, but it makes it seem as a low, like it's very like low from what they steal from workers. So the workers cannot bring this company to to court in order to demand that they give them back their wages that they're stealing from them.
A 2017 study shows that because of minimum wage violations, which is only one form of wage theft, in the 10 most populous states, 2.4 million workers lose about $8 billion annually, which is nearly a quarter of their earned wages. A typical victim of wage theft is losing on average $3,300 per year and receiving only $10,500 annually. If similar trends are found in other states, the amount of wage theft only from minimum wage violations would be more than $15 billion annually. Now, this is more than the value of all stolen merchandise from property crimes.
Now, during the pandemic, even after its surge, 34% of restaurant workers experienced more wage theft in 2021. The acting administrator of the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division stated that wage and hours violation in food service is higher than any other industry. 46% of restaurant workers reported that their employers did not pay time and a half when working overtime, and a third of surveyed workers said their tips did not bring their earnings up to the minimum wage.
In periods of high unemployment, such as during the pandemic right now, which has taken a huge toll on the U.S. economy, where we've seen these massive layoffs, studies show that the risk of being underpaid is greater for workers during times of high unemployment and high job loss. That was the case during the 2008 recession, and it's predicted to be even worse. Not all the statistics have come out yet, but since COVID, it's predicted to be even worse in the advent of the pandemic. And as a matter of fact, the rate of probability that low-wage workers will be ripped off by their boss and paid less than the minimum wage, taken advantage of, it fluctuates between 10 and 20%, depending on what the unemployment rate is in the state that they live in.
Overall, workers in the industry report that there has been an increase in sexual harassment and customer hostility in 2021. 75% of tipped workers said their tips have decreased and have been harassed over enforcing COVID-19 safety protocols. This resulted in more than 54% of workers saying that they intend to leave the industry, and almost 80% say they will only stay if they receive full, livable wages and tips. So which communities are hit worse with wage theft?
I feel the communities that are affected the most are basically like the working and poor classes. But to go further than that, I think Black and brown poor people here in the United States, just for the fact that historically there's been a marginalization of people of color from the inception of the United States, from the wealthy white males taking all the money, and through the theft of indigenous land theft.
Immigrants are another segment of society which are hit hard by wage theft, and they work at some of the lowest paying and most laborious jobs in America, and at the same time are one of the most victimized by employers and are not paid fairly. They get paid less than minimum wage, work very difficult hours, and do not receive overtime. Now, these workers often do not have the funds to hire attorneys to fight their employers, and even if they do and win in courts, more often than not, they will not see a dime.
Another thing, too, to consider is just a massive undocumented labor force that we have here of undocumented workers, that they themselves also have rights to minimum wage laws, but yet they are afraid because companies threaten them with calling ICE, the immigration police, in order to deport them.
Women, African Americans, and immigrant workers are significantly more likely to become a victim of work theft and report it. This is largely because these minorities constitute most of the low-wage workforce. Government investigations on employers are scarce, and the workers have to report violations to government agencies or courts, which is very challenging for these types of workers.
I mean, the worst demographic that it's for is for undocumented workers, because, of course, they lack the protection, the resources, the legal means to do anything about it when their boss has withheld what they're rightly owed, because they can't go to law enforcement, they can't go to the courts, because they're putting themselves at risk, and they're likely to be deported. And so undocumented workers are an example of a demographic that are at the most at risk. And by some estimates, non-citizens or undocumented people were more than 114% more likely than citizens to have their labor rights violated.
And now to fight wage theft, union leaders in Rhode Island have restarted a campaign to make wage theft a felony. Last year, they received the backing of the state's attorney general, and the state Senate passed legislation that would have made wage theft of more than $1,500 a felony, but it did not pass in the House. Now, one union leader says that they are campaigning for this bill because making wage theft a felony will make employers think twice about taking advantage of the working people.
Opposers of the bill state that managers could become felons for making honest administrative errors. They do not explain, however, why these honest administrative errors always tend to deduct from workers' wages and never accidentally add to it.
Of course, we know that, whenever the situation is the reverse, if a worker commits, petty theft, whether at their job or anywhere else, that they face possible jail time or legal prosecution or at the very least termination from their job. But unfortunately, in the United States, white-collar crime and blue-collar crime are treated very differently. And when employers commit theft on a much larger scale to the tune of billions of dollars per year, they very often get away with it, and untold amounts of millions or billions in wages go unrecovered by the government, by the Department of Labor.
Now, stealing from the poor, we know it's nothing new. The rich and wealthy take advantage of the poor wherever and however they can because they feel they can get away with it and that the poor are just simply too weak to fight back. So when the poor steal from the rich, wealthy news agencies feel threat from the poor, they will fill TV channels with footage from a man stealing from a department store or shopping mall, but they sweep the far larger stealing from the poor by wealthy corporations under the rug of corporate corruption. And outside, we check in with Abbas Montarim. He's going to also give us his take on how corporations steal billions from workers.
Capitalism is a system that is exploitative and criminal to its core. It steals the wages of the worker, all for the corporate capitalists to rack in huge profits. And no, I'm not referring to wage slavery, which is yet another exploitative part of capitalism. I'm talking about wage theft, which is one of the many ways capitalist corporations exploit workers. These capitalists and the corporations, they are literally stealing your hard-earned money, and many times people don't even realize it. First, what is wage theft? Wage theft is when a company steals a worker's wage, and this can happen in many different ways, whether it's paying less than minimum wage, not paying overtime, or not paying for all of the work that was completed. It's a so-called white-collar crime that predominantly impacts low and middle-income workers. Through wage theft, corporations steal $50 billion, over $50 billion from their employees every single year. Literally, they are committing robbery against their employees, yet rarely face any type of consequence. Corporations, they do this by taking quote-unquote small amounts of money from workers, but they do this to workers en masse. And if a worker isn't in a union or the workforce isn't properly organized, the worker in reality can do little to stop from being exploited. Even if the worker attempts to sue, the company steals such a quote-unquote small amount of a wage that if a person tries to take it to court, they will end up losing money because of how expensive it is to sue a company. Now imagine being one person trying to take on a multi-billion-dollar transnational company that has infinite resources and numerous lawyers. The lawyers, they will literally drown the person in hell of paperwork. And not only that, but if someone is living check to check, they can potentially face retaliation by the employer and lose their job or get hours cut. And if they're undocumented and the employer knows this, they can literally get a worker deported. This effectively puts the worker into a subjugated position where they back up against the wall. And this shows the true exploitative nature of this capitalist, racist system. These corporations, they're rarely held accountable. And when they are held accountable, companies get a small slap on the wrist, and the reward is always greater than the fine. A company might make billions and billions off of wage theft over the years and get a small fine in comparison to what they have stolen. If we look at the infamous Walmart, since 2000, it's estimated that Walmart has spent $1.4 billion in fines due to wage theft. But this is literally nothing. This is nothing in comparison to the total revenue that Walmart makes. As in fiscal year 2021, Walmart generated revenue of $559.2 billion. These corporations, they just treat these fines as part of their business strategy, because in the end, they're making massive profits by stealing wages. And the government, they allow all this to happen because the government is literally ran by and controlled by these corporations. The government will always be allied with monopoly capitalism. And in many ways, the USA is really the United States of corporations. And the goal of the US is always to make profit. So of course the government will allow this to happen. And every once in a while, they're gonna slap them with a fine and call it regulation and accountability. But if an average person commits a robbery like they do, they will be faced with a lengthy prison time. Bank robbers literally get years and years in prison, but when Wells Fargo steals wages from its employees, it's merely, it gets a fine if they're even caught. Even the smallest of so-called crimes under this capitalist system are more punishable than corporate theft. For example, a black man named Fairwayne Bryant, he is spending life in prison for stealing a set of hedge clippers. And George Jackson, he was falsely accused of stealing $70 from a gas station and was literally assassinated by prison guards. Yet these corporations, they steal billions upon billions of dollars from workers every single year. And this shows the capitalist system for what it is. It is exploitative, it is criminal, it is anti-human. And these capitalists, they literally tell you to pick yourself up from your bootstrap and go get a job. And even when you get a job, they steal your hard-earned paycheck. They steal your wages. It must be understood that wage theft is a fundamental part of capitalism. It is not something that can be reformed through more regulations, even though regulations, they can do some good. But as long as the capitalist system is held intact, this will continue to happen over and over again. The capitalist system as a whole must cease to exist. When a few people control the corporations, factories, land, resources, and raw materials, there will always be exploitation and theft. This exploitation can only cease to exist when power is put into the hands of the people. This is power to the people.
And that was our show, everyone. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, Daniel Arya, and do join us again next week for another episode of We the People. Bye-bye for now.